Okay, everyone, welcome again to this next edition to VMACS. Just a quick reminder of the ground rules that are also posted in the chat. Everyone's audio and video is going to be muted. Your video can never be turned on either by me or by any of us or by you. In terms of the audio during the Q&A session afterwards, if you raise your hand, we'll give you the ability to unmute yourself, but we'll never unmute your mic without your prior consent. Again, please use the Q&A feature for asking clarifying questions along the way. Reserve the chat in case there are technical or other difficulties that need to be addressed. And so without further ado, our moderator today is Stefania Albanese. So Stefania, you take it away.
Thank you so much, Kurt. So today we're having a paper by David Baqaee and Emmanuel Farhi on nonlinearities in disaggregated economies. Just to remind everyone, the presentation is 60 minutes. You can ask your clarifying questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and David will be answering those. And there will be an opportunity for you to ask in-person questions after Emmanuel has completed his talk. So I'll just pass it on to Emmanuel, who is going to start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting this paper. This is joint work with David Baqaee from UCLA, who's here. And it's called Nonlinearities in Disaggregated Economies with Implications for the Covid-19 crisis. So Covid-19 is a very unusual aggregate shock. It's a messy combination of big and heterogeneous supply and demand shocks. And the question is how we should think about their macroeconomic impact. Should we just add them up, or do we need to think about amplification and interactions? That is, do we need to think about nonlinearities? And to answer this question, we're going to use a general disaggregated model and aggregate up from the micro level to the macro level. What we're going to find is that there are quantitatively large nonlinearities, so large amplification, large interactions, and we're going to try to explain where they come from and why they matter. So I'm going to jump right in and describe the structure of the model. So there are going to be N produced goods and G factors, which are for now going to be in inelastic supply. Final demand is going to be a homothetic aggregator. So think about a CS aggregator, for example, of the different goods in the economy. And the goods are going to produce using other goods as intermediates and factors. So with a bit more detail, final demand is going to be maximizing a homothetic aggregator D. You see that C1, C2, Cn are the final consumptions of the different goods in the economy. And omega D is going to be a demand shifter, which is going to play an important role. So it can change people's preferences, the way they want to spend for fixed prices. So this demand is maximized subject to the following budget constraint. You see that the left-hand side is the expenditure side. So the final demand spends on all the different final goods. PI is the price of good I, CI is the final consumption of good I. And the revenue side is you have revenues from factors. PF is the wage of factor F. LF is the supply of factor F. And then potentially you have profits, and the profits represent income. Now let me turn to the goods. So good I is going to be produced under constant returns with the following production function. So yi is output, ai is the TFP of that producer, and fi is a production function that takes as inputs all the other goods as intermediates, xi1, xi2, xin, and all the different factors as well, li1, lig. And this producer is going to maximize profits, taking prices as given. And you see that profits are just given by revenues minus expenditures on intermediate goods minus expenditures on factors. Finally, as I already mentioned, factor supplies are going to be inelastic for now. What's our concept of equilibrium? Well, it's very straightforward. Agents optimize and markets clear. So we're going to do comparative statics. We're going to start at initial equilibrium and perturb it with shocks. What kind of shocks are we going to think about? There are going to be supply shocks, so shocks to the TFPs of the different producers, and shocks to the supplies of the different factors. So AI productivity, LF supply of factor F. There are also going to be demand shocks. So these are shocks to the composition of demand. Okay, so maybe, I'm afraid of getting contaminated if I go to the restaurant, so I don't go to the restaurant. It's a change of preferences. Now, all these shocks, the supply shocks and the demand shocks, they could be driven by preferences, or they could be induced by policy. So maybe the government doesn't let me go to a restaurant because it's worried that if I go there, I get infected and then I infect other people. And our analysis is going to be consistent with both. Finally, these shocks that I'm taking as primitives, they could also be equilibrium outcomes in a richer model. Okay, so for example, labor supply could be endogenous, but then you could plug in the change in labor supply in the sort of comparative statistics that I'm going to be doing to figure out what the effect is going to be. Let me just say 2 words about the generality of the framework. So I've allowed only TFP shocks, but it's without loss of generality because we have full flexibility in specifying the network of producers. And so it's very easy to capture factor augmentic shocks, for example, by introducing fictitious producers that transform a factor into a factor for a particular producer. We can also, I've assumed constant returns to scale, but it's very easy to capture variable returns to scale a la Mackenzie by introducing fixed quasi-factors to the different producers. And finally, I'm going to largely go with an intra-temporal interpretation within a period, but you can totally apply this analysis intertemporally across periods using the Arrow-Debreu trick of indexing commodities by dates and states. So before I describe the first results, we have to go through a few input-output definitions. Okay, so these objects are going to show up repeatedly, and it's important to define them precisely and understand what they represent. So we're going to treat final demand as a producer 0 that's going to produce the final good. And we're going to treat factors as endowment producers. Then we have an input-output matrix, omega ij, which records the expenditure by I on j as a fraction of the revenues of I. Okay, and because we have constant returns, the revenues of I are also the costs of I, and so omega ij records the expenditure by I on j as a fraction of the cost of I. So that's the very standard input-output matrix. From that, it captures a notion of direct exposure of I to j. Now, because you have intermediate goods and you have a production network, the exposure of I to j can be direct, or it can be indirect through k, or indirect through k and l. And we want to record all these direct and indirect exposures. So that's captured by what's called the Leontief inverse matrix, psi. And you see that you can expand it as a Taylor series, and the different powers of this series encode exposures of I to j through chains of different length. So these 2 objects are going to be very useful because they're going to allow us to capture 2 things. First, how prices propagate forward from upstream to downstream. Okay, and that's going to be captured by the exposure of I to j by repeated application of Shepard's lemma. Second, they're going to record how expenditure or demand propagates backward from downstream to upstream. And this is also recorded by these direct and indirect exposure through the Leontief inverse matrix. I'm going to use the definition of nominal GDP. This is just the nominal value of the final expenditures. And you see that I've used the fact that producer 0 is final demand. So the intermediate inputs used by producer 0 is the final consumption of good I. Finally, an object that's going to be extremely important is sales shares. So you take a particular producer, or it could also be a factor, and you look at the sales of this producer as a share of GDP. As a matter of accounting, it's related to the Leontief inverse. Okay, it's the direct and indirect exposure of final demand to this particular producer. Now, this sales share for a producer is just a sales share, and for a factor, it's the factor income share. So for labor, it would just be the labor share. One object of interest is going to, an aggregate object of interest for us, the main one actually, is going to be real GDP. And we're going to call that output. And we're going to try to be careful to define it as it is computed in the data. Okay, so we're going to define changes in real GDP by deflating changes in nominal GDP by changes in the GDP deflator. Okay, that's the way GDP is computed by national income accountants. Now, there are a lot of subtleties that arise when you think about GDP in the presence of demand shocks. Okay, and they're covered in the paper. I'm not going to have time to go into it today. But you get very exotic path dependence properties, and you get important divergence between real GDP and welfare. So in the paper, we also talk about welfare and how to think about that. And the nonlinearities in GDP and in welfare are going to be different. So GDP and welfare are going to behave the same way at the first order for linearities. But when you think about nonlinearities, they're going to be different. But I won't have time to talk about the nonlinearities in welfare today. We're going to focus on real GDP. So I'm going to specialize a little bit the model for the purpose of the presentation, and everything it can be generalized. So I'm going to assume a very general nested CES economy. Okay, so you could have as many nests as you want with as many different elasticities as you want. And you're going to have a network in these CES nests. Okay, so that captures any nested CES economy that you can think about. And I can always, if I have a nested CES economy, rejiggle the network, relabel the network so that each node corresponds to exactly one CES nest. So from now on, each producer is just going to be one CES nest with one elasticity. But this is without loss of generality. Now, in that formalization, the way we're going to think about the demand shifter is a share shifter in the final demand nest. So the final demand nest is just a CES nest with an elasticity. That's the final demand elasticity. And we're going to shift the shares on the different goods in that CES aggregator. That's our demand shifter. So now I'm ready to tell you about the first result. And we call this an aggregation equation. So it tells you what the impact of the shocks is on output to the second order. So you have two lines here. The first line is the first order effect. The second line is the second order effect, and it starts to capture nonlinearities. So at the first order, this economy, it's the impact of the shock is just given by Halton's theorem. So Halton's theorem tells you that the impact of a supply shock, be it to productivity or to factor supply, on output is given by the sales share of this shock, of the entity that you're shocking. So for example, if you reduce the supply of a factor, that's going to reduce GDP by the share of this factor. That's the elasticity. So it's an envelope theorem that relies on the efficiency of the equilibrium. The second order terms, you see that they don't depend just on sales shares, but on changes in sales shares. And these changes in sales shares are equilibrium objects. Because of the shocks, the shares are changing, okay? And that can either amplify or mitigate the effect of the shock. So to think again about the reduction in the supply of a factor, delta log LF negative, if because of what's happening in equilibrium, the share of that factor is increasing, then that will amplify the reduction in output from the shock. Okay. So this theorem is a bit reduced form in a sense because you don't know what the equilibrium changes in sales share is as a function of microeconomic primitives. And I'm going to show you another set of equations that's going to give you exactly that. And in particular, you see at this stage that in this formula, you don't see the network and you don't see the elasticities. And the reason is that the network and the elasticities are going to matter only through the changes in sales shares. They're going to shape the changes in sales shares because of the shock. Finally, there's an interesting observation, which is that if you look at demand shocks in isolation, so imagine there's no other shock, just shocks in demand, then you see that the second order term is going to be 0 because delta log AK is 0 and delta log LF is 0. So that means that demand shocks by themselves have no effect whatsoever at any order on GDP. They only matter via interactions with supply shocks. Now, I don't want to go through these equations, okay? I just want you to show you the sort of things that show up there. So this gives you changes in these sales shares that we need to plug in the aggregation equation as a function of microeconomic primitives. And the things that show up there are the network and the elasticities of substitution. Now, there's one case that's very simple. It's the Cobb-Douglas case. In this case, all the elasticities are equal to 1. And that means that the only reason why the sales shares can change is because of demand shocks. Supply shocks will not trigger any changes in the sales shares. So that means that all the nonlinearities are coming from the interaction between demand shocks and supply shocks. And that can lead to amplification or it can lead to mitigation, okay? So let's say you have a negative shock to a factor. If at the same time, demand is redirected directly and indirectly towards goods that use this factor intensively, then that's going to increase the share of its factor, and that's going to amplify the negative effect on output. And vice versa, it could be mitigated if demand shifts away from the factor that's being reduced. And the network is very important in propagating these demand shocks. And so that's why you see the Leontief inverses showing up there. Let me just give you some concrete examples now. So let me give you examples of amplification of negative supply shocks by demand shocks. So in France, there were some forced closures of warehouses of Amazon's because of concerns with contamination with COVID. And it's pretty clear that at the same time, consumers wanted more Amazon. Okay, so that's something, this shift in demand is something that will amplify the negative effect of the reduction in labor at Amazon in these warehouses. Similarly, closer to home in the US, it's all over the news, these meat packing plants, you know, you have COVID cases in these meat packing plants, and so they're being closed, you're reducing labor there. And I don't know about you, but I think a lot of consumers are shifting their expenditures towards basic stuff like meat. So that would amplify this negative supply shock. But you can think of mitigation as well. So for example, you know, we're closing restaurants, and I think consumers are shifting their demand away from restaurants also, you know, they don't want to go there, they're afraid. And so that would mitigate the impact of the restaurant closures. Same thing for cinemas and things like that. So let me give you just a quick numerical illustration, and it's not going to be something quantitative driven by data, just to show you the sort of things that show up. So it's two sectors of the same size. Each sector produces only with labor, and there's a reduction in labor in one sector. And we're going to compare a scenario where you have simultaneous demand shocks that happen together with the supply shocks towards or away from the affected sector. And so you get something like this. So here on the x-axis, you see the size of the shock. So it's how much we're reducing labor in this one sector that's getting the shock. And on the y-axis, you see output in ratio to the initial level of output. So you see that as the shock unfolds, output goes down. It makes sense. It's a negative supply shock. The blue line is what happens if you don't have demand shocks with this supply shock. The yellow line is what happens if you have demand shocks that redirect demand towards the sector that's experiencing the negative supply shock. And the red line is what happens if demand is redirected away from the sector that experiences the negative supply shock. And you see amplification in the first case and mitigation in the other. Now, let me talk about another case that's very tractable, and for which we're actually going to be able to have a completely global characterization. So the network can be as complicated as you want, but we're going to impose that all the elasticities are the same. So all the elasticities in production and in consumption are the same. And the only shocks are shocks to factor supply. No demand shocks, no productivity shocks. If you have that, then you can completely aggregate the model, and output is given by an as if CS aggregate production function for the factors. And the shares that show up in there are the shares of the factors in the true economy. And the elasticity of substitution of the CS production function is the uniform elasticity of the original network economy. So that shows you a very deep sense in this case in which the network is completely irrelevant. Okay, it matters only to the extent that it creates these factor shares. But given factor shares, no other property of the network is important to figure out the impact of negative labor supply shocks on output. So it's a very striking example, a very striking result. And it also shows the conditions that are needed for the network to matter. And we think it's realistic to think that the network does matter, but you need to move away from that. Okay, and we give examples in the paper. I'm not going to have time to do it today. So you need non-uniform elasticities, or you need demand shocks, or you need TFP shocks. And then the network starts mattering a lot. But without that, we have this network irrelevance result. And it's very easy to work with this example. Okay, so you get, if you want to do a second order approximation, in this case, it's extremely simple. So the first order term is still Halton. And because there are only factor supply shocks, you don't see the productivity shocks anymore. And the second order terms capture the nonlinearities, but they're extremely simple in this case. Okay, they're the product of something that depends on the elasticity of substitution and of the variance of the shocks. So the different factors are getting different shocks, and what matters is the variance of these shocks. So you see that the nonlinearities depend on the interaction of complementarities. Okay, when theta is less than 1, in that case, the output function is going to be concave and negative shocks are going to be amplified. But you need to interact that with a shock that's very heterogeneous. Okay, otherwise these complementarities don't matter. So what really matters for the amplification of negative shocks is complementarities times heterogeneity. Now I'm going to give you a numerical illustration that's going to be a little more serious than the one before. So we're going to try to use some actual data. And I should say that, perfect data is really not available. So we're left a bit to conjecture what the shock is. But we're going to try to cook up a shock that is inspired by some possibly realistic scenario. So it's a complicated economy that we're going to work with. It has 66 sectors, sectoral production using capital, labor, and intermediates. Factors cannot be reallocated across sectors. We're thinking about the short run. Elasticities are uniform. And we're thinking only about the labor supply shocks. And that shock we're going to construct using the data that Mongi et al. And Dingle and Niemann have put together, where they look in each sector, what's the fraction of workers that can work from home? And then we're going to say, okay, those who cannot work from home, a fraction of them are removed from the workforce. They cannot work. And that fraction is X. So the bigger is X, the bigger is the shock. And we're going to compare the outcome of the model to that of an aggregate model that has a CS production function with the same elasticity, but with a single labor aggregate and a single capital aggregate. So that model is going to trivialize the heterogeneity in the different labor shocks. So this is what you get. We have two scenarios, a more extreme scenario where anybody who cannot work from home is removed from the workforce, and a less extreme scenario where we leave some of these guys in the workforce. In both cases, and it plots output as a function of the elasticity of substitution. And output is plotted relative to the initial value. So when it's below 1, it means output has gone down. So when the elasticity is close to 1, the model is close to Cobb-Douglas, and you're getting just the linearities, just Halton. When you reduce the elasticity, you start getting complementarities, okay? And that's going to amplify the shock. And you see that you can get a lot of amplification of the shock if you put in a lot of complementarities. And even with reasonable levels of complementarities, you get very sizable amplification. But you get a lot more amplification in the disaggregated model that really takes into account the fact that the shock is very heterogeneous across the labors than in the aggregate model that just aggregates up labor and trivializes that heterogeneity. So what really matters is complementarities times heterogeneity, and then you get big amplification of negative supply shocks. Let me do a more serious illustration where we're going to allow the elasticities to be heterogeneous. And we're going to try to inform our choices of elasticities by empirical estimates. So I don't have time to describe these different values and why they're reasonable. So we're going to play with 3 different sets of elasticities, some relatively low ones, very low ones, to capture the very short run, because in the short run, you can't reorganize things. Some higher ones for the short run, and some higher ones yet for the medium run. Now, this is the same graph. So you see the change in output. And now it's written a bit differently. It's not y over y bar, it's delta y over y bar. So when it's negative, it means that output is going down and it's a percentage reduction. And I'm plotting you that as a function of the size of the shock once again. So you see the blue line is Halton, it's the Cobb-Douglas economy. And you know, with the big shock that we're fitting in, it's a big effect on output. And you see that like 30% if you put the full shock, which is the sort of thing that I think people expect for the next quarter. And then you see what happens when you use lower and lower elasticities. You get more and more amplifications, and the amplification matters more when the shock is bigger and when the elasticities are lower. These are really non-linearities. So these can matter a great deal, basically. You can get a lot of amplification and a lot of interaction. So there's more in the paper on that part that I don't have time to discuss. So we think about elastic factor supplies, and we think that that's very important in this context. For example, we're giving like relatively generous unemployment benefits because we're trying to put the economy in a freezer and make sure that people will go through this episode relatively intact. But that also reduces the incentives to work, and that can be a problem. We think about reallocation. You know, a big part of the policy response is to try to freeze the economy so that we can unfreeze it when things restart. Well, that's great because you preserve this organizational capital, but you're not allowing reallocations that could mitigate the impact of the shock. So we think about that. And then we also try to talk about welfare. So let me move now to the second part of this talk, where we're going to try to think about a different set of nonlinearities that are going to be Keynesian nonlinearities. Okay. So these nonlinearities, you can see right away where they're going to come from. So when you think about Keynesian effects, one of the things you think about is nominal kinks. You have downward nominal wage rigidity. Okay, so the wage can go up, but it cannot go down. You have a kink there, and that's going to drive a nonlinearity, a kink, the first order nonlinearity. And you think about the ZLB constraint. You can raise interest rates, but you can only lower the interest rates so far. And when you hit that bound again, so you're going to have a first order nonlinearity, you're going to get a kink. And now we're going to try to think about these nonlinearities as well. So the structure is going to be as follows. There are going to be 2 periods, the present and the future. And there's going to be an intertemporal problem where you're going to maximize utility subject to an intertemporal budget constraint. And the present is going to be the same as before. You have this input-output network and everything, but we're going to add downward nominal wage rigidity. So wages are going to be downward sticky in nominal terms. Okay, they can go up, but they cannot go down. So that's, and really, we want to handle this nonlinearity. It's occasionally binding downward nominal wage rigidity constraint. The future is going to be relatively simple. It's going to be full employment, and we're going to fix nominal expenditure in the future as well. So monetary policy is going to try to do its best, but we're going to keep it as a parameter. And you could think of it as trying to ensure full employment subject to the zero lower bound constraint. So let me describe a bit the intertemporal problem. So you have an Euler equation that's very familiar to everybody. And you see that it takes this form. So rho is the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. And PY is the price index today. So if prices go up today, that means that you're expecting deflation. And that means that the real interest rate is higher. And so you reduce your consumption today. So that's this effect. And d log zeta here is an aggregate demand shock. So this aggregate demand shock, it's a mixture of things. It depends on what monetary policy is doing. It depends on whether people shift their preferences towards the future. So maybe, you know, when I'm locked down at home, I don't have a lot of opportunities to spend, and I prefer to keep my money to spend later where I can go to the restaurant again. And you have output in the future that also matters as well. So one thing that you see right away from this is the following property. Look at this Euler equation. You see that output can only go down if prices go up when there are no aggregate demand shocks. So the only way in which, if you just put in supply shocks, the only way in which output can go down is if prices go up. That's stagflation. Now, when you put in aggregate demand shock, you can get deflationary forces as well. So for us, it's going to be more convenient to think about nominal expenditure. Okay, so there's an Euler equation for nominal expenditure, how much you spend in nominal terms today. And that takes the following form. And we're going to focus throughout this talk on a very simple case that's also, I think, relatively realistic, where the intertemporal elasticity of substitution rho is equal to 1. That means that nominal expenditure, changes in nominal expenditure, are going to be completely exogenous. Okay, so there's a given exogenous amount of nominal expenditure today, and the question is where that expenditure is going to go. So let me talk a bit more about the factor markets. We're going to think about different types of factors. There are some factors that are always going to be flexible. Okay, they have no downward rigidity in their wages, and we're going to call them capitals. Okay, so for capital, typically you don't think that there's a downward rigidity on the rental rate, although you could think about capital utilization, but let me not get into that. And so those factors are going to be inelastic and have vertical supply curves. Then you have another set of factors that we call labors, and we denote by L, and these have L-shaped supply curves. So they have downward nominal wage rigidity. So if in equilibrium their wage goes up, nothing happens. The full labor is supplied. But if in equilibrium wages go down, they can't. You hit the downward nominal wage rigidity constraint, and there's going to be a reduction in the amount of labor that's going to be supplied. So labor is going to be demand determined in that region. So what we don't know is which factor are going to be flexible in equilibrium. Their prices are going to go up, their wages are going to go up, and which factors are going to be rigid in equilibrium. They're going to be against the downward wage rigidity constraint. And we're going to try to see if we can characterize what's happening there. So let me look at the capitals first. So these are the flexible factors. This is a very conventional factor supply, factor demand diagram. The factor supply curve is vertical. The factor demand curve is going to be downward sloping. And so imagine that in this market, you have a shock to the supply of the factor. So the blue curve moves. And maybe you have the shock to the nominal demand of the factor. And so the red curve moves. The wage is going to be completely flexible. It can go down if it has to. And the factor that's going to be supplied is just going to be equal to the exogenous supply shock. Notice here that the nominal demand for the factor, okay, is the change in the share and the change in the nominal expenditure. There's a missing D log here. Okay, so the share of the factor is just the share of the pie that it's getting. And then what's the size of the nominal pie? Well, it's nominal expenditure. Okay, and so the nominal demand for the factor, the way it changes is d log f plus d log e. And that's going to matter for the factors that are potentially rigid. So we're calling them labors. And you see that there's a downward nominal wage rigidity constraint. So the wages cannot go down. Okay, so imagine that there's a reduction in the demand of this factor. Then the equilibrium, the wage of that factor will not be able to fall and clear the market. And so the quantity of that factor that's going to be supplied is going to be lower than its potential. So you're going to have slack in that factor market. You're going to have Keynesian unemployment in that factor market. And that really depends on the comparison of whether the demand for this factor goes down more than the supply of this factor. So if the supply goes down more than the demand, then there's not a problem. Okay, there's no Keynesian unemployment. But if the demand goes down more than the supply, there will be Keynesian unemployment in this market. And that's going to happen endogenously in this model. So I'm not going to walk you through the propagation and aggregation equation, but I'm going to tell you a bit what happens. So first is you have to, multiple equilibria is a bit of an exotic thing usually, but you really have to worry about that in this context. It's very easy to get multiple equilibria, so beware. What's very difficult is the nonlinear determination of the set of rigid factors. So which labors are against their downward nominal wage rigidity constraint. And we're going to try to provide some results on that. You can also provide another set of results where you say, well, I know which factors are rigid, and then let me do some local comparative statics conditional on these factors being rigid and the other one flexible. And then you can really combine the analysis that we did in the neoclassical case, the propagation and aggregation equations, actually exactly the same ones. The only thing is that now the shocks to the labor that's supplied is not just a labor supply shock. Some of it comes from the Keynesian parallel model. Okay, so it's an equilibrium outcome, but you can plug it in what we were doing before and characterize comparative statics in this local sense. So let me show you one example. This is Cobb-Douglas again. So that case is very simple. And what you see here is first and I'm staying only at the first order in this case, because these Keynesian effects, they introduce first order nonlinearities. Okay, you have kinks. So the slope on one side of the kink is not the same as the slope on the other side of the kink, and that's what we want to capture. So here you see the neoclassical effect of the supply shocks, shocks to productivity, shocks to factor supplies. And that's just given by Halton's theorem once again. And here on the second line, you see the Keynesian amplification. And the Keynesian amplification, it comes from the fact that maybe a nominal expenditure goes down. Okay, there's a missing zero on the other side of this min here. So if nominal expenditure goes down, then that's going to push nominal demand for the factors. It's going to push you against the downward nominal rigidity constraint, and that's going to reduce labor for Keynesian reasons. And that will amplify the negative effect of the shock on output. Second, maybe there are demand shocks, and they redirect demand away from a particular labor. And if you redirect demand away from a particular labor, the wage of the labor should fall in equilibrium, but it can't. And that's going to create further unemployment. Okay? So you can get first order nonlinearities that amplify output reductions through Keynesian channels. And you see once again that the network is very important to understand these things. I'm also going to return to this uniform elasticity and labor supply shocks again. So there, the network irrelevance property that we discussed earlier is preserved. Okay, so it's still if you have two networks, as long as they produce the same initial factor shares, they're going to have exactly the same equilibrium property. The network is going to be irrelevant, conditional on factor shares, and that's going to be very convenient. You're going to have very different behaviors if goods are substitutes or if goods are complements. And again, our focus is going to be on complements. So you can have, if you have substitutes, then if you have a reduction in one of the labors, that's going to increase the demand for the other labors. So you're not going to get Keynesian unemployment. You're going to get a unique equilibrium in this case with full employment. With complements, you're going to get something very different. If you have a reduction in the supply of one of the labors, that's going to reduce the demand for all the other labors. Why? Because if you reduce the supply of a factor, its share goes up. So that means the share of the other factors go down. And for fixed nominal expenditure, that's going to reduce the demand for the other labors. So their price should drop, but it can't. And so you get Keynesian unemployment. And you can construct an equilibrium where actually the Keynesian unemployment is in the factors that have the smallest supply shocks. And you have the possibility of multiple equilibria. So here you see that these sorts of effects are related to the literature that looks at supply and demand shocks in Keynesian model, and to the very nice recent paper by Guerrieri et al. But we're going to really be focusing on a different part of the parameter space and different mechanisms relying on complementarities and nonlinearities from occasionally binding downward nominal wage regime. So I should also say that this network irrelevance case, it generalizes to also include aggregate demand shocks. So you can have labor supply shocks and aggregate demand shocks. Now, what you can do is you can do global comparative statics in this case. Okay, so we do uniform elasticities and uniform complementarities. So global comparative statics means I can use delta instead of D. Delta is the discrete change. Okay, it's an exact thing. And there you have this, result that we think is very nice, which is the following. So you look at all the potential equilibria, and you look at all the equilibrium vectors of changes in factors supplied. Okay, so it's an equilibrium outcome because you have some exogenous reductions in some of the factors and some endogenous reductions in some of the factors. And you have the equilibrium set of all these vectors. And you put a partial ordering on this set, which is you compare two vectors, one is smaller than the other if all the components are smaller. So it's a partial ordering. So it turns out that this set is a lattice, okay? And the lattice means that if you take two elements, there's always an element that's greater in the set and an element that's lower in the set. So in particular, there's a unique best equilibrium and there's a unique worst equilibrium. And all the equilibrium that are in the middle are strictly ranked compared to these two equilibria. So the worst equilibrium has the most Keynesian unemployment and the least output. And the best equilibrium has the least Keynesian unemployment and the most output. Using this lattice structure, you can also show the following global comparative statics, which is that changes in output and changes in labor are increasing in the exogenous labor supply shocks and the exogenous aggregate demand shocks. So if you fit in, no matter what their pattern, bigger, more negative aggregate supply shocks, then you know that all the labors in equilibrium, in the best equilibrium, are going to be lower. Similarly, if you add an aggregate demand shock, you know that all the labors are going to go down. So it's a global comparative static result. And it really relies on the complementarities to get this lattice, because you have this property that if you have the reduction of one of the labors for exogenous or endogenous reason, the share of that labor is going to go up. So the share of the other labors is going to go down. Because nominal expenditure is fixed, that means nominal demand for the other labors is going to go down. And that's going to create Keynesian unemployment, more Keynesian unemployment in the other labors. And we use that to prove this lattice structure and to prove this global comparative static. Okay, so you have a multiplier that's embedded in this model. So let me show you first like a toy numerical illustration, and then I'll show you perhaps more serious quantitative illustration. So I'm going to assume that for my toy illustration that the elasticities are uniform. And I'm going to take two labor markets of equal size. Okay, and there could be a network, or it's just two sectors producing the labor. It doesn't matter because we have network irrelevance. We're going to consider a reduction, a big one, in the labor supply of one of the labors. Okay, so some workers are removed from the workforce because they would be contaminated in the workforce or something like that. And we're going to look at what happens in the model, and we're going to compare the outcome in the Keynesian economy that has downward nominal wage utility to the outcome in the neoclassical economy with flexible wages. So you get something like this. So what do we see here? We see output as a fraction of initial output. So if it's below 1, it means that there's a reduction in output. And it's plotted as a function of the elasticity of substitution theta. Okay, so you see that if we're in the range of substitutes here, then there's no Keynesian unemployment. So Keynesian and neoclassical coincide. The range that we're interested in is complements, when theta is below 1. And there you see that output in the Keynesian model is lower than in the neoclassical model. You have Keynesian amplification. Okay, so there's slack in some factor markets, and that amplifies the reduction in output. You see that that comes together with this reduction in employment that I was talking about. So this is the change in this is the reduction in labor in the neoclassical economy. It doesn't depend on the elasticity of substitution. Okay, and it's equal to minus 20% because the shock is 40%, but we're only shocking half of the economy. But you see that in the Keynesian sector, you start generating Keynesian unemployment, okay? And if you have a low elasticity of substitution, you can generate a lot of Keynesian unemployment. So you see a very interesting and subtle pattern here, that Keynesian unemployment is always decreasing in the elasticity of substitution. So the more complementarities you have, the more Keynesian unemployment you have. It's not true for output, okay? You see that the Keynesian amplification is maximized for intermediate levels of the elasticity of substitution, for intermediate complementarities, okay? So Keynesian amplification, if you want, is hump-shaped in the elasticity of substitution, in the degree of complementarity. Why is that? Well, when you lower the elasticity of substitution, two things happen, okay? You get more Keynesian unemployment, and that's bad for output. But at the same time, the share of the factor that's experiencing Keynesian unemployment is going down, okay? So you're reducing endogenously a labor, but the share of that labor that's being reduced is going down. So using the logic from the neoclassical model that I explained earlier, that's going to mitigate the impact of this Keynesian amplification. And that's why it's completely hand-shaped in the elasticity. Actually, if you make the economy Leontief, you get Keynesian unemployment, but the Keynesian unemployment is never bigger than the initial reduction in output in the sector that's being directly hit. And so it doesn't matter for output whatsoever. Okay, so there's this very different pattern. And to get a lot of Keynesian amplification, you need intermediate levels of complementarities, and you need very heterogeneous shocks. Now, let me do a slightly more quantitative illustration. So we're going to use the same 66 sector input-output model as before. And I'm going to concentrate on the higher set of elasticities, okay? So just to go through them here, 0.95 is the elasticity of substitution in final demand. So we're very close to Cobb-Douglas here. 0.5 is the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor. 0.5 is the elasticity of substitution between this value-added aggregate of capital and labor and the rest of intermediates. And 0.1 is the elasticity of substitution across intermediate goods. Okay, so when you look at empirical studies, there's like very low elasticities of substitution across intermediates. What is the shock that we're going to look at? It's the same labor supply shock that we considered earlier. Okay, so in each sector, there's some fraction of agents who cannot work from home, and we're going to remove a fraction of them from the workforce. And the bigger is X, the more of them we're removing from the workforce, the bigger is the supply shock. To illustrate the importance of the heterogeneity, we're also going to look at another shock where we're going to say, look, if you're in a sector where the ability to work from home is above median, then we're not going to shock your labor at all. We're only going to shock the labors, reduce the labors of the sectors that have a below median ability to work from home. So think of this as sort of trying to understand the range of possibilities. What we would love to have is to have actual data on how much employment is reduced in these different sectors and everything, but that's just not available for now. And so we plan to, of course, as more data becomes available, use that. And so what we're going to do is compare the outcome of the neoclassical economy and of the Keynesian economy. So that's what it looks like. This is output as a fraction of steady state output, of initial output. So again, if it's below 1, it means that you have a reduction in output. And it's plotted as a function of the size of the shock. So focus first on the yellow and the purple line, these two lines here. Okay. So this is when we don't do this above median, below median business. Okay, we just remove a constant fraction of workers who can't work from home in all sectors. And what you see there is that you don't get a lot of Keynesian amplification, basically. To get more Keynesian amplification, and it can be sizable, look at the other shock now, that's more heterogeneous. Okay, because we're only shocking the sectors that have a below median ability to work from home. And in that case, because there's more heterogeneity in the shock, you see that you get more Keynesian action. Okay, and basically you're going to get a lot of Keynesian action in the sectors that do not experience an exogenous reduction in supply. The Keynesian mechanism kicks in faster if demand goes down and supply hasn't gone down. And that's why you're picking up with these differences. So you can get something big here. So, and what's interesting is that you get more Keynesian amplification, even though the shock is milder, okay? Because it's more heterogeneous. Now, something very different happens with unemployment in the following sense, that even when you feed in the full shock, that's bigger but less heterogeneous, you see that you generate a lot of Keynesian unemployment, okay? And so that's back to this insight that with complementarities, you can get a lot of Keynesian unemployment, but you get something hum-shaped in the elasticity for the reduction in output. Because once again, if you have Keynesian unemployment in a sector, that means that the share of that sector is going down. In a factor, that means that the share of that factor is going down. And because the share of that factor is going down, it means it's becoming less important as its supply is being reduced, so it matters less for output than for unemployment. And for the milder but more heterogeneous shocks, you get a lot of Keynesian unemployment now, even though once again the shock is milder. Okay, so you see that you can get a lot of action, but that it's pretty subtle. Now let's focus on other shocks, and in particular, I think a shock that's extremely important is a very large negative aggregate demand shock. And so here, just to motivate that, I'm showing you the results from a survey from McKinsey. And they asked to a sample of consumers the following question. Over the next 2 weeks, and this was done back in March, over the next 2 weeks, do you expect that you will spend more, about the same, or less money on these different categories than usual? And the histogram bars are the fraction of respondents who said increase minus the fraction of respondents who said decrease. So you see that apart from groceries, across the board, you see very large intended reductions in spending. So you can't directly interpret that as an intensive measure. They're just saying if they're planning to reduce spending or not, but it gives you an idea that I think there's probably a very big negative aggregate demand shock out there. So how do we think about that? So let's say that there are like these negative labor supply shocks and a large negative aggregate demand shock. So we're going to look at them together because remember, once again, we're about nonlinearities and interactions. So for the supply shock, we're just going to do the same thing as before. So we're going to scale the supply shock with X. And X is, once again, the fraction in each sector of people who cannot work from home that are removed from the workforce. So we're going to scale this supply shock, and we're going to combine that with a fixed negative aggregate demand shock. And we're going to put a big one because we think it's a big one. And we're going to play with a smaller one and an even bigger one. So here's what happens, okay? So this is output, again, as a fraction of the initial equilibrium. So when it's below 1, it means there's a reduction in output. And we're plotting that as a function of the size of the shock. Okay? So the aggregate demand shock is as a fixed size, but we're scaling up the size of the supply shock, of the negative labor supply shock. So initially, you see that you have only the effect of the aggregate demand shock when you look at the Keynesian economies. So blue and red are the Keynesian economies. Okay, sorry. Yeah, blue and red are the Keynesian economies. So what you see there is that initially you only have the negative aggregate demand shock, and you start putting in the negative supply shock, but you're not reducing supply enough that supply dominates demand. So initially it doesn't matter. And then as the supply shock gets bigger, then the supply shock starts overcoming in some factor markets the demand shock, and you start seeing reductions, independent reductions from the supply shock, okay? And it happens faster with the lower aggregate demand shocks than with the higher aggregate demand shock, obviously. And what you see there is like also the impact of the aggregate demand shock fades as you size up, as you scale up the negative supply shock, because the supply shock starts dominating, you know? And so a given negative aggregate demand shock is going to matter less for output with larger negative supply shocks. And then you can compare these outcomes to what would happen in the neoclassical economy. And in the neoclassical economy, of course, the negative aggregate demand shocks don't do anything, and you just get the effects of the negative supply shocks. Where the aggregate demand shocks keep mattering a lot, even when you scale up the supply shock, is for inflation. So when there's no supply shock, you get a lot of deflation from the negative aggregate demand shock. And then you start scaling up the aggregate supply shock, initially nothing happens. And then at some point, the supply shock gets big enough that it overcomes demand in some factor markets, and you start seeing some inflationary pressure from this large deflationary equilibrium. And then you get more and more, less and less deflation, and at some point you start getting inflation when you increase the size of the shock, okay? And so you could be in a deflationary equilibrium if there's a large aggregate demand and a large negative and a negative supply shock, and you could be in a stagflationary equilibrium if the supply shock is much bigger than the aggregate demand shock. So there's more in the paper. We try to think about semi-downward flexible wages. We try to think about policy. I don't have time to talk about this. Let me just try to conclude now. So I think it's very important to grapple with this very large, complicated, heterogeneous shock that's COVID. It's a bunch of heterogeneous supply and demand shocks, and you have to think about how they aggregate up. And the point that we try to make is that you can't just add them up. You really need to think about amplification. You really need to think about interactions. that is you really need to think about non-linearities, both for neoclassical and for Keynesian reasons. And that's those non-linearities are important qualitatively, and they're important quantitatively. They're important for designing the policy response to this event, and to go quantitative and everything. It's important to have the right disaggregated data, and hopefully more of that data is going to become available as time goes by, and we're planning to revisit the numbers when that happens. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. That was a great talk. So this starts the open Q&A portion of the discussion. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And when we see you raising your hands, we will give you the opportunity to speak, but then you will have to unmute yourself. So we just let you speak. So actually there's 2 questions already. So we're going to start with Federico Di Pace. Federico, you can unmute yourself. Federico? Federico? Okay, let's go to the next hand, which is Clarisse. Clarisse, you have to unmute yourself and then you're able to speak.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was wonderful. I was thinking about applying this framework to the study of a shock, the asset purchases of the European central banks. And we have interactions among countries. We have non-linearities, we have heterogeneities of shocks, because we have even classical countries, neoclassical countries. I think this framework would apply very good. What do you think about it? Thank you.
So thank you. It's a great question, and I think you could really try to sort of merge this model with the sort of ingredients that would be important to think about the impact of these asset purchases. And so I think for that, you really need to think about, you know, credit constraints for households. You need to think about credit constraints for firms. You need to think about the sorts of assets that are being purchased. Are these safe assets? Are these risky assets? And then all of that is going to then interact with the sort of structure that we have described. And it's not just through aggregate effect, because once again, you know, maybe you're going to purchase loans that are concentrated in a particular sectors, or maybe there's going to be more failures in one sector than in another. And you really need to think about the granularity and the disaggregation to think through the impacts of these policies.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So Ralph, actually, one of the panelists had a question. Ralph, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk, Emmanuel. Just a quick question on policy, because you talked about this kind of Keynesian slump where you can go when you have these complementarities. And I was wondering what kind of policy options are possible to bring that back to the first best, whether fiscal policy, when you just think about the standard liquidity trap, where fiscal policy could you bring, you know, back out of the zero lower bound, whether that also applies here and whether you have worked on that?
Yes. So I didn't have time to discuss this, but we do try to touch on that in the paper. So let me talk about fiscal policy for a second. So so you can think about fiscal stimulus in this context and how it works. And as you can see, like what we try to emphasize is that this shock is very heterogeneous. Like some markets have a Keynesian slump and some markets do not. Some markets you see wages going up. And so an untargeted blanket fiscal stimulus is just not a great tool, basically, in this economy. And we try to think about the way in which you could try to target fiscal policies in a smart way to try to increase demand for the factors that are experiencing a slump. So we try to discuss that a little bit in the talk, in the paper. We think about monetary policy as well. And so here, let me say two things. First, if you try to do, let's say, forward guidance, for example, so you're at the zero lower bound, can't do anything about the interest rate today, but could try to lower interest rate in the future and stimulate spending in the future. So there's a sense in this model in which that's mechanically that wouldn't be super effective, because you're going to waste some of this monetary policy on the factors that are actually flexible. So you're going to just increase their wages. But if you do a big enough forward guidance in the model, it would get you out of the slump. And then you have the usual problems of forward guidance with commitment and all of that. There's another more subtle effect which mitigates the effect of a forward guidance type policy here in the presence of complementarities for the following reason. So let's say you do forward guidance. Well, that's not going to increase the price of the wages that are against their downward nominal rigidity. They're going to stay stuck there. But it will increase the wages of the flexible factors. And because of complementarities, it will increase the share of these factors, and it will reduce the share of the sticky factors. And so you're going to lose some bang from this policy in that way.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple of questions from the floor. We'll go to William Diamond first. William, you're allowed to talk. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks so much. My question is, I guess in this COVID crisis, people have talked a lot about the role of firms' liquidity as something policy needs to deal with. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on if firms have something like a cash in advance constraint, if that could somehow lead to more misallocation of resources in this economy, if there's some kind of policy response that might be.
So, I mean, so if firms have some kind of credit constraints and things like that, then, that could trigger sort of negative productivity shocks endogenously in the model, basically. So what I've talked about today is sort of making the labor shocks be endogenous. But you can also think about making the productivity shocks be endogenous through these kinds of channels. And then we try to think about that in the paper as well. And so that would be something that policy would need to think about. And that loops back to the first question with asset purchases, and not just asset purchases, some of the programs that the Fed is doing, where it's trying to lend to businesses and everything. So that's definitely a good idea through the lens of this model.
Okay, thank you. I just encourage everybody to raise their hand and ask questions if they have a question. There's no questions from the floor right now. William, are you done, or do you want to comment?
That's all. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. So while we wait from additional questions from the floor, I actually have a question, which pertains primarily to the neoclassical version of the model, which I think is really elegant, and I really like the structure of it. But a lot of the quantitative effects do depend on these deep parameters that are very hard to know about, such as these elasticities of substitution and so on. So all your results are sort of dependent on what these are, quantitatively. My question is, are you confident enough to use the model to actually pin them down from data? Of course, you sort of do that in some of the quantitative analysis using, this new work on flexibility and so on of various types of industries and occupations. But if I'm a policymaker and I'm taking your model, I kind of want to have a confident sense of what that elasticity of substitution is. And so can I actually use your model to, from data, extract that? And then if I can do that, does the level of disaggregation matter? So if I go at the 2-digit level, at the industry and occupation, am I going to get different results than at the 3-digit level? And if so, how do I interpret that?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And maybe I didn't emphasize enough, although hopefully I did a little bit, that there's a lot of uncertainty on these parameters. So all these elasticities of substitution, there is some empirical guidance from the literature, but you know, you have large confidence intervals around these elasticities. There's also something that compounds this problem, which is, you know, we all understand that elasticities are not the same in the very short run and in the longer run. I mean, Samuelson wrote very eloquently about this with the Le Chatelier principle. Mm-hmm. And so some of the estimates of the literature are, you know, a bit longer run than what we would like to understand the very short run impact of this model. So a lot of uncertainty, and that's why what we try to do is to show the range of possibilities instead of like committing to one set of elasticities. Now on to the second part of your question, which is very interesting as well, is could we try to use the model to actually figure out what those elasticities are? And so here I want to acknowledge a very serious identification problem in the data, because it's all sorts of shocks are hitting the economy at the same time. And these shocks, they will, you know, you will see shares changing, but it's going to be very difficult to be confident that the only reason that these shares are changing is because relative prices are changing. Maybe there are demand shocks, maybe there are all these other things. And so you need to find some way of parsing through that and of identifying, you know, independent exogenous variations in relative prices to pin down elasticities. And I actually don't, I mean, I'm sure we'll come up with like great ways of doing that. All the clever empiricists will be focused on that problem, but it's not going to be an easy one because it's a very messy environment with lots of things happening at the same time.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of thinking. And then when you get to the Keynesian version of the model, in addition, on top of that, we layer the multiplicity of equilibria, which sort of compounds the problem to some degree.
Yes, but what we try to do is, so I think that that lattice result that we showed, it gives you a sense that, you know, it's not because you have multiple equilibria that you're in an anything goes kind of world and you can't say anything. You can provide global comparative statics on the whole set of equilibrium. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's who knows in the data if you're not jumping from one equilibrium to the other. It's a definite possibility, and that's going to compound the problem that we were discussing earlier. So I think what's nice about these sorts of structures is it forces you to be honest, you know, about what you know and what you don't know. And if you write a simpler, more aggregated model, maybe you don't see some of these issues because you don't see some of these elasticities, but it's just because you assume them away. It's not because you can confidently say that they don't matter because you don't see them in your paper. And so, yes, you know, you need to think about all these things. The level of aggregation really matters. And the better disaggregated data we have, the more we can be confident about the sort of answers that come out. But it's an exercise in humility. I am completely on board with that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So that we have a question from the floor from Elias. Elias, you can speak. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, and congratulations for your paper. I found both of them to be very engaging, and I come from a finance background. I have a question regarding the different performance, so to speak, of a Keynesian and a neoclassical economy, with particular reference to wage rigidities. If I have captured your core correctly, you do not discuss so much government intervention from a Keynesian point of view, flat government spending. You implement gains from the point of view of keeping wages constant in the short run. So if we assume two different economic setups, which one performs best, quote unquote, from a welfare point of view?
Sorry, what are the two setups?
If we assume a neoclassical economy based on...
No, so the Keynesian economy is, you get Keynesian amplification, so it's worse. The question is, but So one of the things we try to convey is when you say worse, you need to say what you're thinking about. And it's different if you think about output and if you think about unemployment. And it can be a lot worse for both, but it's always much worse for unemployment than it is for output. Now, in terms of government interventions, I didn't have time to discuss it, but I think I talked a bit about it in response to one of the questions. We try to think about, government spending or monetary stimulus. We try to think also about tax incentives. So, one policy that has a pretty bad rep is payroll tax cuts. But I mean, there's a sense in which maybe that could do a good job here in this model to try to mitigate a bit downward nominal rigidity.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from Holt Dwyer. Holt, you're able to speak. Please unmute yourself.
Hi. So my question had to do with how inflation relates to this whole thing. So it would seem to me that essentially, if the degree of downward distortion caused by this Keynesian effect is a nominal one, and the impact depends on sort of how central one sector is, you might think that like the optimal level of inflation in the economy might change over time as some sectors become, as say a labor type input becomes more central. Is there any feature of that in the model, or am I thinking about this totally wrong?
No, great question. So you're thinking about this, I think, in precisely the right way. And I want to relate the notion of centrality that you talked about to the sort of stuff that I've discussed. So the centrality in our paper, the model tells us what it is. And the measure of centrality of a factor is its factor share. Okay, that captures the centrality, the importance of this factor. And so if you have a big factor that has a lot of Keynesian unemployment, then that's pretty bad for output. And so you really need to do something about it. So the centrality measure is really the factor shares. And more generally for a producer, the centrality measure is the sales share. It's also called the Domar weight in reference to Harold Domar. And that is what the model wants as a centrality measure in these production networks.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question from the audience, from Jeline. Jeline, you can unmute yourself.
Hey, this is a great talk, but I have a question regarding the supply shock. And my question is, thinking of the supply shock, do you think the disruption of the supply chain, and I mean the global supply chain disruption due to, well, different parts of the world have different degrees of the shock, and also because of the recession in the transportation and the logistic industry, would that cause a different channel which propagates the supply shock to your setting?
Yes.
Thanks.
Thanks. It's a great question. So the supply chains are completely part of the model that I presented. You have these supply chains in there. You have these production networks. And what we're trying to show with these results that we're providing, okay, is how they matter. And so you saw this one case where if you're a supply chain person, maybe you're a bit disappointed. It's this network irrelevance case. So you have supply chains and everything. They're very complicated. They can be very long and everything. But for these specific labor supply shocks, and if the elasticities are uniform, it turns out you can think about the effects just thinking about the shares of the different factors, okay? Now, that's not true in general, and it's more complicated when you deviate from that and when the network matters. So I showed you some example with this Cobb-Douglas thing where you show that the network really matters for the propagation of demand. But the propagation of supply shocks, once you move away from uniform elasticities, is also very dependent on the properties of the network and very dependent on the structure of supply chains. So there it starts really, really mattering. The second part of your question that I think is very interesting is what about the international dimension and international supply chains, global value chains. So, I mean, what I presented is a closed economy model, but in work that we've done with David in a previous paper, we've sort of laid down the groundwork to think about these effects in open economies. And said you could see really how the global supply chains matter for a particular country and how shocks could propagate from one country to the other. You know, there's a lot of interesting things to say about this, but it would probably be I would need another talk to get into it.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So I think Kurt had a question. Kurt?
Hi, Emmanuel. Again, great. Thanks for a great talk. I was just wondering if, because we have a few minutes, you know, you mentioned kind of that there could be very differences in terms of the impacts on welfare as opposed to output. Could you maybe just give us a little bit of flavor of that, or maybe if you've looked at it in the context of some of the examples you've done? I mean, if you haven't, that's fine, but it'd just be kind of interesting to think about how those diverge and how we should think about it, since
yes,
obviously, you know, we're very interested in the welfare impacts of this.
Okay, so thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to discuss that. So let me start by saying the following. Let's go to the neoclassical model because it's easier. If you don't have demand shocks, okay, then it's relatively easy to think about welfare, but I have to be precise about what I mean by welfare here. And it's going to coincide with output, okay? So it would be welfare in a compensating variation kind of sense, okay? And so you would say, you could compute that and it would coincide with the change in the quantity index that's output in this case. It's much more delicate when you have demand shocks. The reason it's much more delicate is because basically GDP and welfare are no longer the same thing. Why? Because you have changes in expenditure that are not driven by changes in prices, okay? And that breaks the link between GDP and welfare. Not only that, but you really need to take a stand now on whether these changes in the composition of demand are preference driven. I don't want to go to the restaurants because I don't want to get sick, or policy induced. The government is preventing me from going to the restaurants because he doesn't want to get sick and infect other people. In the first case, it's a change in preferences. In the second case, it's from the private agent's perspective, it's a distortion. Now we can compute the welfare in the narrow sense of saying what's the compensating variation of the private agents. It's harder, of course, to think about welfare from the government perspective when you internalize these externalities, if you don't write a model where you know where these externalities are coming from. And we don't have that superstructure in the model. So another thing that's really weird that happens when you have these shocks to the composition of demand is the following. So it's related to some of the exotic properties I mentioned. So the GDP, you can only compute it in changes along a path, and it becomes path dependent when you have shocks to the composition of demand. Welfare is not path dependent. So that's another way in which these two things become very different. Now, let me bring it back to earth a little bit and have a concrete example. So imagine that, you see that the supply of restaurants is going down. There's a negative supply shock there. and you see that people are redirecting expenditure away from restaurants. Well, imagine that it's driven by a government intervention. I would really like to go to the restaurants, but the government is preventing me from doing that. Well, in that case, the mitigation that you would get from the fact that I'm spending less is a fake mitigation. It's not a mitigation for welfare. Now, if it's preference induced, it's the other way around. There's part of the mitigation that you're not getting in GDP, and the mitigation in welfare is even more from the fact that you're redirecting away. And so you have to handle these effects and take this stance. And what I said for the composition of final demand, it applies also to factor supply. So I didn't talk about that at all during the talk, but in the paper, what we try to do is to think, okay, let's endogenous factor supply. And let's say it's a ROI model, for example. Okay, so I choose to work in this sector, or maybe I go into leisure. Well, then you have shocks to the composition of labor supply. Okay, and the same issues I mentioned for the composition of demand matter for the composition of factor supply. And so you really need to think carefully about welfare versus GDP once you bring in those considerations. And we try to do that, and I didn't have time to go into it today.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I think Morten has a question. Morten?
Yeah, I was going to come back about the international dimension. So I guess another dimension of the international bit is also demand shock, in the sense that sort of the whole world is depressed at the same time. But maybe it's a bit special because it may be correlate with productivity across sectors. Have you any idea? Would that matter?
So you say like the whole world is depressed?
Yeah, so like think about France, if they try to pull out of the crisis, then they're going to be up against the problem that there's going to be very little demand for their goods because many other countries will still be struggling. And then it's sort of the more productive sectors may also be those that are more intensive in exports.
Yes. So you would need to basically sort of extend the model to have this international dimension, and then you could think about all these considerations. And they're likely to be very important. I mean, like China, for example, is trying to restart its economy, but nobody's consuming anything. So that's a problem, clearly. And so you would have this propagation of, neoclassical and Keynesian demand effects and supply effects through supply chains, not just across sectors in an economy, but across countries as well. And I think it's likely to be very important. But let me say this, it will be more important for more open economies than for relatively closed economies. So, for example, David and I are working with people at the Bank of Belgium, and they have this really fascinating disaggregated data that allows you to, that's not available in a lot of places. And if you want to do anything in the Belgian context, you kind of have to confront the open economy issue. It's such a small open economy, it's front and center in everything. So if you assume that things are just going down in Belgium, but the rest of the world is fine, and then you compare that to something bad is happening in Belgium and in the rest of the world, you get very, very different effects. And that's going to matter less for economies that are more closed, like the US. It's not to say that it won't matter at all, but it will matter less than for very open economies. And you need to think about openness very carefully when you have trade in intermediate goods and international supply chains. So you get more effects than in models when you don't think about that.
And of course, what happens in the US is going to be a big demand shock on the rest of the world.
Yes. So these are all very important things.
Okay, thanks, Morten. So we have time for, I think, one last question, maybe two. So let's start with Simon Mongi. Simon, you can unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, we might expect some firms to exit unable to cover fixed costs. And I thought, if I layered on top of this your other paper with David, with your Darwinian returns to scale to kind of create some within industry heterogeneity, then there might be some offsetting effects due to reallocation. I was wondering if you were prepared to kind of speculate on whether you think kind of reallocative effects would be likely to be quantitatively important.
Well, I'm always ready to speculate, but so what Simon is referring to is the following. So if you think about a sector and you start disaggregating more, so let's say you have different firms in a sector, and they're affected in different ways by what's going on, and like there could be distortions in the sector, maybe because the firms are charging different markups, and you know, you're gonna reallocate demand towards or away from firms that have higher or lower markups, or more distortions, you know, firms that are more credit constrained or less credit constrained, and that's going to have effects on TFP. Okay, sort of endogenous effects on TFP, because you're gonna improve or reduce the amount of misallocation in the economy. But so let me try to look to relate that to the discussion we had with Stefania earlier. In order to have to shed quantitative light on these questions, you sort of need to know what the wedges are. So you need to be able to say, you know, either I know what the markups are, or I'm able to measure, or I have a model to confidently generate them, or I need to know what the credit friction wedges are, or I need to be confident in the model that I have to generate them. And then you can make these sorts of statements. I would be shocked if, as we try to do that, these things don't matter. These effects from what other people have done and from what we've done with David, we know that they can be extremely potent. So I think it's a great thing to look into, and a great question.
Okay, thank you so much. We are actually out of time, so we have to close the session here. So let me thank all the attendees, and particularly Emmanuel and David, for a great presentation and discussion as well. Thank you so much. And our next VMACS talk is going to be on Tuesday next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks, and stay safe, everyone.